The first time I realized the HOA president was willing to destroy his own neighborhood, just to humiliate me. He was standing ankle-deep in lake mud, screaming at me, while 3 county trucks blocked the road behind him. 2 weeks earlier, that same man had marched down to the fishing dock in front of half the neighborhood and treated me like a criminal. I had been sitting there quietly with a thermos of coffee, 1 fishing rod, and my old tackle box, the same one my mother used before she passed. The sun had barely cleared the trees when Martin Keller, president of the Willow Bend HOA, came storming across the grass with 2 board members behind him and a security guard filming me on his phone. His face was red, his jaw was clenched, and he pointed at me like I had broken into his house instead of sitting beside a lake the county map, labeled as public access for decades. Before I could even reel in my line, he kicked my tackle box hard enough to spill hooks, sinkers, and bait across the dock. Then he grabbed the folding chair under me, yanked it sideways, and sent me stumbling onto the wet boards in front of everyone. People stopped casting. A little boy holding a blue fishing pole froze beside his grandfather. 1 woman covered her mouth. Martin did not care. He leaned over me and accused me of stealing HOA amenities, trespassing on private community property, and harassing residents by refusing to follow rules from a neighborhood I did not even live in. I tried to tell him my house sat outside Willow Bend. I tried to tell him my deed gave me lake access from my own backyard. But Martin only smiled like a man who had already decided the truth was whatever he could shout loudest. He ordered security to drag my cooler and chair off the dock. Then he had one of the board members slap a laminated notice onto the railing with my name on it, banning me permanently from the lake. The most humiliating part was not being kicked out. It was hearing the neighbors whisper while Martin told them I was a freeloader, a squatter, a problem resident who needed to be made an example of. So I left without raising my voice. I picked up every hook he had scattered. I folded my chair. I carried my mother's tackle box back across my own yard while Martin laughed behind me, telling everyone the HOA controlled the lake, the shore, the dock, and every drop of water in it. He was wrong about almost all of that, because by the end of the month, that beautiful fishing lake was gone. The boats were resting in cracked mud. The HOA dock hung uselessly above dry earth. The expensive stone shoreline they had just built was exposed as an illegal structure. And Martin Keller, the man who had banned me from touching the water, stood speechless while a county inspector posted a red violation notice on the HOA clubhouse. He thought he had kicked me out of his lake. He had no idea I was about to buy the dam that kept it alive. I never bought that house because it was impressive. It was small, older than most of the new homes in Willow Bend, and the kitchen floor creaked in one spot, no matter how many times I tried to fix it. The siding needed paint. The back steps leaned a little to the left. In the winter, cold air slipped under the laundry room door unless I rolled up a towel and pushed it against the frame. But the first time I walked into the backyard and saw the lake through the trees, I knew why my mother had loved that place. The water sat behind the property like a quiet secret. In the morning, fog lifted off the surface in thin silver layers. In the evening, the whole lake turned orange when the sun dropped behind the ridge. There was an old sycamore near the bank, with roots thick enough to sit on, and beneath that tree was where my mother used to bring me when I was a kid, back when the land around the lake was still mostly open fields and gravel roads. She would sit there with a cheap fishing pole, a sandwich wrapped in foil, and more patience than anyone I ever knew. I was never very good at fishing, but she always told me that was not the point. The point was being still long enough to remember what mattered. After she died, I spent almost a year working overtime, fixing commercial refrigerators, rooftop units, walk-in freezers, anything that paid enough to help me buy that little house. People thought I was buying property. I knew I was buying the last place where I could still feel close to her. That was why I never caused trouble. When Willow Bend Estates expanded on the other side of the lake, I kept to myself. When the HOA installed new lights near the clubhouse, I ignored it. When they started putting up glossy signs calling the lake a private community feature, I figured it was just marketing. None of it had anything to do with me. My house was outside their gates. My deed was separate. My taxes went directly to the county. I did not use their pool, their gym, their clubhouse, or their landscaping crew. All I did was walk from my own back door to my own patch of shoreline and fish under my mother's tree. For years, nobody cared. Some of the older residents even waved when they saw me. A few brought their kids down on summer mornings and asked what bait worked best. I let them use my net when they needed it. I helped a grandfather untangle line from a dock post once. I pulled a plastic grocery bag out of the water whenever one drifted in. To me, the lake was not a status symbol. It was a place people treated gently because everyone got something peaceful from it. Then the neighborhood changed. The houses got bigger. The HOA dues went up. The board started talking about exclusive value and resident-only amenities. They repainted the clubhouse, hired a private management company, and began sending out newsletters with polished photos of the lake like they had created it themselves. That was when Martin Keller became HOA President. Martin had the kind of confidence that made ordinary people step aside before they even knew why. He spoke in legal-sounding phrases, wore pressed golf shirts to Saturday meetings, and acted like every sidewalk, mailbox, tree, and blade of grass existed under his personal authority. He did not ask questions. He issued warnings. He did not have conversations. He made announcements. At first, I barely noticed him. Then one afternoon, I found a folded notice tucked under a rock on my back steps. It said, "The Willow Bend HOA had observed me accessing the lake without authorization. It demanded that I stop using community-owned recreational property immediately, or face enforcement action." I read it twice, standing there in my work boots, still smelling like Freon and metal dust from a 12-hour service call. Then I looked past the paper, down the slope, toward the sycamore tree, toward the water where my mother used to sit, and I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger yet, something quieter. The feeling you get when someone walks into a room they do not own, points at the last thing you have left, and tells you it belongs to them now. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA that suddenly decided your peace was a violation, you already know how quickly a small notice can turn into a war. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what happened next was not just about fishing, and it was not just about a lake. It was about a man who thought paperwork only mattered when it had his signature on it. The second notice came 3 days later, and this time it was not tucked under a rock. It was taped directly to my back door. I found it at 6:15 in the morning, just as I was leaving for a service call at a diner 20 miles away. The paper was sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, like some kind of official court document. Except the letterhead belonged to the Willow Bend HOA, an organization I had never joined, never paid, and never given permission to step onto my property. The notice accused me of unauthorized lake access, repeated trespassing, interference with resident enjoyment, and failure to comply with community recreational rules. At the bottom in bold print, it said I owed $750 in violation fees, with additional penalties added every day I continued using the lake. I stood there in my work uniform, holding that paper in one hand and my lunchbox in the other, trying to understand how a private neighborhood association had decided it could fine a man who did not live in the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was a mistake. By noon, I knew it was not, while I was under a restaurant roof replacing a condenser fan motor. My phone kept buzzing. My security camera had detected movement in the backyard. When I opened the live feed, I saw 3 men in yellow safety vests walking across my lawn. One of them carried wooden stakes. Another dragged a roll of orange construction netting behind him. The third man, a contractor I had never seen before, pointed toward the slope, leading down to the lake like he was marking a job site. They were not on HOA land. They were not near the clubhouse. They were standing less than 30 feet from my back steps. I called the number on the side of their truck. The man who answered said they had been hired by the Willow Bend HOA to secure the lake boundary and prevent unauthorized access. When I told him he was on private property, He did not sound surprised. He told me the board had provided a site map and instructed them to block the footpath immediately. I left work early. By the time I got home, they had already driven 6 stakes into my yard. Orange netting stretched from a young maple tree to the old sycamore by the bank. A bright warning sign hung in the middle of it, declaring the area restricted to Willow Bend residents only. That was the first time I felt real anger. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that makes you throw things or say something stupid. It was the slow, heavy kind that settles behind your ribs when you realize someone did not misunderstand your rights. They simply decided your rights were inconvenient. I pulled into my driveway and found Martin Keller waiting near the side gate with his arms crossed, as if he had been expecting me. He was dressed like always, pressed polo shirt, sunglasses, spotless white shoes that had never touched a real worksite in their life. 2 board members stood behind him, both holding folders like they were part of some official inspection team. The contractor leaned against his truck, pretending not to listen. Martin did not apologize. He did not ask permission. He told me the HOA had voted to protect the lake from non-resident use and that my continued access had created liability concerns. He said the board had authority over all common recreational areas around Willow Bend and that the lake had always been maintained for the benefit of paying residents. I told him my property line ran to the shoreline. I told him the path he had blocked was on my deeded land. I told him again that I was not a member of his HOA. He smiled at that the way a man smiles when he thinks patience is something he is generously giving to someone beneath him. He said, my deed did not change the practical reality of community control. He said, if I wanted to challenge the HOA, I was welcome to hire an attorney and spend more money than the issue was worth. Then he added that people like me usually calmed down once they realized how expensive being difficult could become. That sentence stayed with me. People like me. He meant people without gates, people without board seats, people who drove service vans instead of luxury SUVs, people who could be embarrassed in public, fined on paper, and pushed off land they owned because fighting back looked too expensive. Then Martin made his biggest mistake. He stepped past me, walked down the slope, and pointed at the sycamore tree. He told the contractor the tree might have to come out because it interfered with the new lake access barrier. That tree had stood there longer than his entire HOA. It was the tree my mother sat under when she was sick but still wanted to fish. It was the only thing in that yard I had promised myself I would never change. I warned him not to touch it. Martin turned around in front of everyone and said the HOA would do whatever was necessary to protect its property. Its property, the words landed harder than the notice. Harder than the fine, harder than being humiliated on the dock. Because in that moment I understood the entire plan. They were not just trying to keep me from fishing, they were trying to make the lake look legally, visually, and practically like it belonged to them. The signs, the fines, the barriers, the contractor, the language in the letters, all of it was designed to create a record where they acted like owners long enough for everyone else to believe it. And maybe that trick worked on residents who were afraid of the board. But I was not a resident. I was the man whose backyard they had just invaded. That evening after the contractor left, and Martin drove away looking satisfied with himself, I walked down to the orange netting and took pictures of every stake, every tire mark, every footprint, every scratch in the grass. I did not tear anything down. I did not yell across the lake. I did not threaten anyone. I simply stood under my mother's sycamore tree, looked out over the water Martin claimed was his, and realized something very important. If the HOA wanted to turn this lake into a property fight, then they had chosen the one fight where paperwork mattered more than confidence, and I was about to start reading every page they hoped I would never find. I did not touch the orange netting that night. That was the hardest part. Every instinct in me wanted to pull those stakes out of the ground, throw that warning sign into the bed of my truck, and drag the whole ugly barrier back across the street to the HOA clubhouse. It was my yard, my grass, my path to the water. My mother's tree standing there with construction tape brushing against its bark like someone had tied a warning label around a memory. But I knew what Martin wanted. He wanted me angry. He wanted me on camera ripping down a fence. He wanted one blurry cell phone video. He could play at the next HOA meeting while telling everyone I was unstable, aggressive, and dangerous. If I gave him that, the truth would stop mattering, because the story would become about my reaction instead of his trespass. So I took pictures. I started at the back steps and photographed the entire yard in slow, careful sections. I captured the tire marks in the grass, the wooden stakes, the orange netting, the warning sign, the footprints near the sycamore roots, and the place where one stake had been driven less than 4 feet from the property marker I had installed years earlier. I made sure every photo had time and location data turned on. Then I walked the path again and recorded a video without saying a word, letting the camera show exactly where the barrier sat. After that, I went inside, made coffee I barely drank, and opened the old metal filing box where I kept my house papers. The deed was there. So were the closing documents, the county tax map, the title policy, the property survey from when I bought the place, and the faded plat my real estate agent had printed for me years earlier. I spread everything across the kitchen table and stayed up until after midnight, tracing lines with my finger while the security camera alerts kept blinking on my phone. The first thing I confirmed was simple. My parcel did not touch Willow Bend HOA property anywhere along the back boundary. The line ran down the slope across the old footpath and all the way to the shoreline. The HOA's common area was on the opposite side of the lake near the clubhouse and the paved parking lot. Martin had acted like the entire lakefront belonged to him because residents used it. But use and ownership were not the same thing. The next morning, I called the county recorder's office before my first job of the day. I asked for every recorded document connected to Willow Bend Estates: subdivision plats, easements, maintenance agreements, lake access records, developer transfers, and anything mentioning the dam. The clerk on the phone sounded tired, but when I mentioned the lake, she paused. Then she told me there were older records I would need to come see in person because they had never been fully digitized. That was the first crack in Martin's wall. At lunch, I sat in my service van outside a grocery store, scrolling through the HOA's public filings on my phone. Their website bragged about the lake constantly: beautiful sunrise photos, fishing tournament announcements, resident picnic flyers, newsletters calling it the centerpiece of Willow Bend living. But when I looked at the legal description of the HOA common property, the language was strangely narrow. It listed the clubhouse parcel, landscaped entrances, stormwater ponds, walking trails, and a section of shoreline. It did not list my bank. It did not list the entire lake. And it did not list the dam. That word started bothering me, dam. Most people looked at that lake and saw water. I looked at it and suddenly started wondering what held the water there in the first place. The south end of the lake narrowed into a grassy berm with an old metal outlet pipe and a concrete spillway partly hidden under weeds. I had walked near it 100 times without thinking about it. It was just part of the scenery. Now it looked like the most important thing in the whole story that afternoon. I paid a surveyor for an emergency boundary review. It hurt to put that charge on my card, but I knew guessing would not be enough. A few days later, he came out with his equipment, walked the yard, checked the old pins, compared the recorded plat, and marked the line with bright flags. When he finished, he stood near the orange netting and told me the HOA barrier was not close to the boundary, it was over it. At the widest point, their stakes were more than 18 feet onto my land. I remember looking at those flags and feeling my anger change shape. It stopped feeling like panic. It became something colder and more useful: proof. From there, everything moved faster. I saved every email Martin had sent. I downloaded the security footage of the contractor entering my yard. I requested the HOA meeting minutes where they voted on lake access. I checked the contractor's license. I searched county permit records for the fence, the dock, the new shoreline work, and the small storage building near the water. Some permits were missing. Others described work in vague language that did not match what had actually been built. Then the county clerk called me back about the old records. She had found the original developer documents from before Willow Bend existed. The lake had started as a farm pond created by an earthen dam on a separate parcel south of the water. That parcel had belonged to the Whitaker family for decades. It had never been transferred to the HOA. It had never been included in the common area, and according to the county dam safety file, the owner of that parcel, not the HOA, was responsible for inspection and water control. So I sat in my van with the printed copies on the passenger seat, reading the same paragraph over and over. Martin had screamed that the HOA controlled every drop of that lake, but the county records were telling a different story. The HOA had been selling residents the image of ownership while depending on a piece of land they did not own, a dam they did not maintain, and a legal chain they had apparently never bothered to understand. That night I did not sleep much. I placed the deed, the survey, the photos, the emails, the permit searches, and the old dam records into one folder by the time the sun came up. I had stopped thinking like a man being bullied off a fishing spot. I was thinking like a property owner with evidence. And Martin Keller had no idea that the quietest person he had humiliated on that dock was now holding the one file that could drain the power out of his entire HOA. The first attorney I called told me not to get excited. That was not what I wanted to hear after spending nights surrounded by maps, deeds, photos, and county records. I wanted someone to say Martin Keller had overplayed his hand so badly that the whole HOA would collapse by Friday. Instead, the attorney listened quietly, asked for every document, and then gave me the kind of advice angry people hate but property owners need. He told me not to threaten anyone, not to remove the barrier myself, not to post about it online, not to step into a public argument with Martin at the clubhouse. He said, if the documents were what I claimed they were, the strongest move I could make was to let the record speak before I ever did. So I sent him everything. The survey, the security footage, the HOA notices, the fine letter, the photos of the stakes on my land, the old plat showing my property line running to the shoreline, the county records showing Willow Bend owned only part of the lakeside common area, and finally the dam file, the strange little piece of paper that turned a fishing dispute into something much bigger. 2 days later, he called me back. His voice sounded different. He said the HOA's position had a serious problem. Then he corrected himself and said it had several serious problems. They had no recorded easement across my property. Their barrier appeared to be a trespass. Their notices cited internal HOA rules against a non-member. Their contractor had entered my land without permission, and their public claim that they controlled the lake was not supported by the deed records he had reviewed. But then he paused. He told me the dam parcel was the key. The lake existed because of that earthen dam at the south end. Without it, the water level would drop until most of what Willow Bend called its luxury fishing lake became a muddy basin with a narrow creek running through it. The HOA had treated the lake like a private amenity, but the structure controlling the water was sitting on a separate parcel that had never belonged to them. The Whitaker parcel. The attorney had looked into the estate listing. The land was still available. It was ugly on paper, no house, no driveway worth mentioning, no pretty view, just brush, a berm, an old outlet pipe, and responsibility. That was probably why nobody in Willow Bend had bothered to buy it. To them, it looked like useless leftover land. To me, it looked like the handle on the entire lake. I did not make the decision quickly. I sat with it for days. I walked down to the orange netting every evening and looked at the sycamore tree. I thought about my mother sitting under it. I thought about Martin kicking my tackle box across the dock while everyone watched. I thought about that fine letter taped to my door, like I was a tenant being warned by a landlord. Then I made an offer on the Whitaker parcel. The closing was quiet, no dramatic music, no audience, just paperwork, signatures, a cashier's check that made my stomach hurt, and a deed recorded with the county. When it was done, I owned the strip of land at the south end of the lake, including the dam, the spillway, and the old outlet structure. that Willow Bend's entire postcard image depended on. I did not call Martin. I called the county engineer. That was the moment the story changed from neighborhood drama to official record. I told the engineer. I was the new owner of the damn parcel and needed to know my legal responsibilities. He pulled the old file and said the structure had been flagged before, for inspection concerns. The outlet pipe was aging. Vegetation had grown into parts of the spillway. There were notes about seepage after heavy rain, but no recent owner response. Then he asked if the HOA had been maintaining it. I said I had no evidence they owned it or had permission to maintain it. There was a long silence on the line. After that, things became very formal. The county scheduled a site visit. The engineer explained that if the dam needed inspection or repair, a controlled drawdown might be required to lower the water pressure. That meant opening the outlet under supervision and reducing the lake level until the structure could be safely examined, not destroyed, not vandalized, not drained in secret at midnight, drawn down legally, with permits, notices, environmental checks, and county oversight. When the written recommendation arrived, I read it 3 times. It stated that based on the age of the outlet pipe, visible blockage near the spillway, and uncertainty over prior maintenance, a controlled reduction of the impounded water level was appropriate before further structural evaluation. In plain English, the county was telling me to lower the lake. The same lake Martin had banned me. From my attorney sent the HOA a letter the next morning. It informed them that I owned the dam parcel, that their contractor had trespassed on my property, that their fines against me had no legal basis, and that a county-supervised drawdown would begin after the required notice period. It also demanded removal of their barrier from my land and preservation of all board communications related to lake access enforcement, construction, and maintenance fees. Martin finally called me less than an hour after the letter went out. I did not answer. He called 6 times, then the emails started. At first, they were angry. He accused me of threatening community property, endangering residents, and trying to punish families who had done nothing wrong. Then the tone shifted. He claimed there must have been a misunderstanding. He said the HOA had always believed it had operational control of the lake. He offered to meet privately, without attorneys, to resolve the matter like neighbors. That was funny, because when I was sitting on the dock with my mother's tackle box, he had not treated me like a neighbor. He had treated me like a trespasser. The real twist came when my attorney requested the HOA-S permits for recent shoreline improvements. The boardwalk, the stone retaining edge, the storage shed, the fishing dock expansion, all the upgrades Martin had used to show residents how much value he was adding. Several of them had been permitted under descriptions that assumed HOA control of land they did not fully own. One structure appeared to extend into the dam parcel. Another sat inside a setback area tied to the spillway. Martin had not just picked a fight with the wrong homeowner. He had built part of his reputation on land records he never understood. By the time the county posted the drawdown notice, the HOA's confidence had cracked. Residents began asking why they had been charged lake improvement assessments. Board members stopped copying Martin on every email. The management company suddenly wanted all communication routed through council. And for the first time since this started, I walked down to the water without fear. The orange netting was still there. The warning sign still said Willow Bend residents only. The sycamore still stood behind it, quiet and patient. But now I knew what Martin did not want anyone else to know. The HOA could control its meetings. It could control its newsletters. It could control the tone of its violation letters. But it did not control the dam. And when that outlet opened, all the authority Martin had poured into that lake was going to drain out with the water. The morning the county arrived, Willow Bend looked less like a luxury neighborhood and more like a crime scene, trying to pretend it was a picnic area. 3 white county trucks rolled in just after sunrise. One belonged to the engineer's office. One belonged to code enforcement. The third carried 2 environmental contractors who had been hired to monitor the controlled drawdown and make sure nothing was done outside the approved order. My attorney followed in his own car. wearing a plain gray suit and carrying one folder that looked too thin to scare anyone until you knew what was inside it. Martin Keller was already there. He had parked his SUV sideways near the maintenance path, as if a $70,000 vehicle could overrule a recorded deed. 2 security guards stood beside him. A few board members hovered near the clubhouse, with clipboards clutched against their chests. Behind them, residents gathered in bathrobes, workout clothes, and golf shirts, staring down at the lake like someone had announced a funeral for their property values. Martin tried to stop the county engineer before he even reached the gate. He kept insisting the HOA controlled access to the lake area and that no one had permission to alter community property. His voice carried across the parking lot, loud and polished at first, the same voice he had used to humiliate me on the dock. But the engineer did not argue with him. He simply asked to see Martin's deed to the damn parcel. That was the first time I saw Martin's confidence flicker in public. He talked around the question. He mentioned years of maintenance. He mentioned resident dues. He mentioned landscaping, fishing events, insurance policies, and community expectations. He said the lake had always been understood as a Willow Bend amenity. The deputy sheriff, who had been called to keep the peace, listened for about 30 seconds, then looked at the recorded deed in my attorney's folder and told Martin to move the SUV, no shouting, no drama, just one calm instruction, backed by paperwork Martin could not talk over. When the outlet was opened under county supervision, the change was slow at first. A dark ribbon of water began sliding through the pipe beyond the berm. The lake surface barely moved. Some residents laughed nervously, like maybe this whole thing would turn out to be nothing. By midday, the laughter was gone. The waterline had dropped enough to expose the first row of stones along the HOA's new shoreline wall. Then came the muddy bases of dock posts that were not where the permit drawings said they were. Then came a buried drainage pipe nobody on the board admitted knowing about. By late afternoon, the bottom of the fishing dock hung awkwardly above the receding water, and the expensive boardwalk Martin had bragged about in 3 newsletters stood on crooked supports sunk into muck. Code enforcement moved from one structure to the next, photographing everything. The storage shed near the lake was too close to the spillway setback. The boardwalk extension had no matching structural permit. The stone retaining edge crossed beyond the area described in the HOA's own filing. Part of the orange barrier in my yard was still 18 feet inside my property line. The inspector placed a red notice on the shed first, then another on the dock entrance, then a third on the boardwalk railing. Each red paper looked small by itself. Together, they looked like the truth finally learning how to speak. Martin stopped performing for the crowd after the second violation notice went up. He pulled his board members into a tight circle near the clubhouse, but even from across the grass, I could see the panic spreading. One woman kept shaking her head. Another board member walked away and started making phone calls. The security guards who had once filmed me like I was a trespasser now stood there pretending they had nothing to do with any of it. Then my attorney handed over the demand letter. It was not just about the lake anymore. It listed the unlawful entry onto my land, the invalid fines, the contractor's trespass, the damage near the sycamore roots, the false claim of HOA control, and the need to preserve all communications related to lake access and construction approvals. It also demanded that the HOA remove every barrier from my property and stop representing my shoreline as part of its common area. For once, Martin did not have a speech ready. That evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. I did not speak much. I did not have to. The county reports, the survey flags, the permit records, and the deed did more damage than anger ever could. Residents demanded to know why they had paid special assessments for lake improvements the HOA might not have had authority to build. Someone asked why the board had threatened a non-member with HOA fines. Someone else asked whether their insurance would cover structures built with defective permits. Martin tried to make me the villain one last time. He described the drawdown as an attack on the community. He said families had lost access to the lake because I wanted revenge, he said. I had chosen mud over neighborly compromise. But by then, everyone had seen the red notices. Everyone had seen the exposed dock posts. Everyone had watched the deputy make him move his sov off land he did not own. The room was no longer listening to the loudest man. It was listening to the documents. And as I walked out of that clubhouse, past the residents whispering in the parking lot, I looked back at the lake. The water was lower than I had ever seen it. The shoreline was raw, ugly, and honest. For years, Willow Bend had sold people a perfect reflection on the surface. Now the mud underneath was showing, and Martin Keller was about to find out that mud keeps records too. The first thing Willow Bend lost was the dock. Not because I demanded it. Not because as I stood there smiling while they tore it apart. The county made that decision after the inspection report came back. The posts were not where the permit said they were. The boardwalk extension crossed into a restricted area tied to the dam structure. The storage shed sat too close to the spillway setback, and the stone edging Martin had praised as a luxury improvement had to be removed section by section because part of it had been installed where the HOA had no recorded right to build. For 3 weeks, residents drove past the lake and saw work crews pulling apart the very amenities Martin had used to brag about property values. The fishing dock was stacked in pieces near the parking lot. The shoreline wall became piles of muddy rock. The orange barrier in my yard disappeared after my attorney sent the second demand letter, and the contractor insurance carrier paid for the damage to my grass, the torn roots near the sycamore, and the surveyor's follow-up inspection. The HOA also had to cancel every fine they had issued against me. All $750 of their made-up penalties vanished in one short board letter that somehow used the word misunderstanding 4 times. My attorney called it strategic embarrassment. I called it the first honest thing they had done, even if they still could not bring themselves to say they were wrong. But the real damage happened at the next public meeting. Residents showed up angry, not at me, at Martin. They wanted to know why they had been charged a special lake improvement assessment when the board had never confirmed ownership of the dam. They wanted to know why HOA money had been used to threaten a homeowner outside the association. They wanted to know why security had been sent to film me on land the HOA did not own. And they wanted to know why Martin had told everyone the lake was completely under HOA control when the county records said otherwise. He tried to survive it. He blamed the management company. He blamed the old developer. He blamed outdated plats, confusing records, and vague legal language. But nobody in that room forgot the red notices on the dock. Nobody forgot the lake sitting low and ugly, exposing every shortcut the board had hidden underwater. And nobody forgot that he had turned a quiet man with a fishing pole into the owner of the dam that controlled their favorite amenity. By the end of that meeting, Martin Keller was no longer HOA president. A temporary board voted to hire a real property attorney, audit the lake assessments, and negotiate a written access and maintenance agreement with me instead of pretending threats could replace deeds. The HOA paid my legal fees related to the trespass claim. The contractor paid through insurance. The management company lost its contract at the end of the quarter. As for the lake, it eventually came back, after the dam inspection, the outlet repairs, and the environmental clearance. The water rose slowly over several weeks. The mud disappeared. The ducks returned first, then the bluegill, then one quiet Sunday morning. I carried my mother's old tackle box back down to the sycamore tree and sat in the same place Martin had tried to take from me. I did not put up a big sign. I did not throw a party. I did not shout across the water at the people who once whispered about me. I just cast my line and watched the ripples move across a lake that everyone suddenly understood a little better. Because property rights are not about who talks the loudest at a board meeting. They are not about who wears the nicest polo shirt or who can put the most official-looking notice on someone's door. They are about records, boundaries, permits, and the quiet patience to prove what belongs where. So, if you have ever been bullied by an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone who thought confidence could erase your deed, leave a comment and share your story, and remember this. I did not win by draining a lake out of anger. I won because Martin Keller forgot that under every pretty surface there is always a bottom. And sometimes, when the water drops, the truth is sitting right there in the mud.